We're going to start out to get us in the mood of church with a short piece from the Detroit Mass Choir that Madeline Wright shared with me. I hope that got you in the mood for our discussion today on the Black Church. I have the privilege of introducing our surprise guest, who's really no surprise to those of you that attend the 8:30 service, where Madeline Wright and her husband Booker are active participants. Madeline was born in Detroit and received her PhD at the University of Michigan. She became excited about African dance while living in Illinois. So when later on she started teaching at Houston Community College, she started an African and African American dance society where they trained teachers and sponsored dance troupes in African and African American dance. She started a program at Wheeler Avenue Baptist Church, a Girls' Rite of Passage program, and she's written a book called Sisters Helping Sisters. Leaving this long legacy behind, upon retirement, she and Booker moved to Santa Fe, where Madeline was instrumental in Santa Fe starting the Santa Fe Soul Festival. We're pleased to have her sharing her experiences with us and her knowledge of the Black church this morning.
Thank you, Judy. And I'm timing myself because all of you had about 15 hours of homework. And we're going to discuss everything in this hour that we have together. So I don't want to take up too much of the time, but I want to kind of amalgamate the things from the videos, from the church services, and from my experience and knowledge about why there has been a need for a free Black space where only African Americans are in the leadership, and to give you a history of some of the things that happened that caused that. Now, in the services that we saw before, my sister is a bishop in the Shrine of the Black Madonna Church. And I asked her, like, what's the difference between a Black church and a white church historically? And she said, white churches perpetuated racism and Black churches help Black people recover and survive racism. So I'm going to give you some historical background for that. And in the church services that you may or may not have had a chance to attend at Oakhurst Presbyterian Church, Reverend Barbee talked about one of the purposes of the Black church was to establish a place that felt like home. And she sang Stephanie Mills' song, Home from the Wiz, and it essentially says that home is a place where there's love everlasting, where people love and accept me as I am. And when we moved on to Trinity United Methodist Church, Reverend Jones talked about the heavy burdens that we bear. And he illustrated it dramatically. And as you can see from the Detroit Mass Choir and from Black services, that they are a performance space. And we saw Reverend Barbee singing as good as Stephanie Mills, and Reverend Jones putting on the heavy burdens of all of the things that we encounter and in our life. And I know that these burdens are not unique to African Americans, but we'll talk about some of the unique burdens that African Americans have borne in the church. And I'm going to use Richard Allen, the founder of the African American, the AME Church, because I grew up in Bethel AME Church in Detroit. And in the South, during the time of enslavement, there always had to be a white person present in a Black church to make sure that they were not planning an insurrection, and to make sure that the parts of the Bible that focused on Moses delivering the slaves out of Egypt, that those portions were not mentioned. And in the South, there were underground Black churches that were called bush harbors, where people would go and celebrate as they wished without being discovered. And in the North, it was different. And one of the differences that we'll talk about is the fact that Northern churches believed that slavery was immoral and should be ended, but they didn't believe that African Americans were equal. And I'll give you some examples, and this is why Richard Allen formed the AME Church. And his story is really quite interesting. He was born enslaved in Philadelphia, and his family was sold to Stokely Sturgis they were sold to pay off debts to Stokely Sturgis. And when Richard Allen was 16, Sturgis sold his mother and 3 siblings away. And shortly after, it's not clear if he was the only remaining slave, but an itinerant Methodist minister, evangelist, preached about abolition, and Stokely Sturgis and Richard Allen, who was then called Slave Richard, were converted to the Methodist religion. And Sturgis was appalled, and I guess he adopted abolitionism, and he gave Allen, or Slave Richard, the permission to buy his freedom. And the cost of his freedom was $2,000, which is usually what you would buy a whole family. And that's equivalent to $38,000 now. And Allen was able to purchase his freedom in 5 years. And one of the ways that he was able to purchase his freedom was that he was a minister and that he preached around the Northeast. And he bought his freedom and moved to Philadelphia and joined the St. George Methodist Episcopal Church. And there he became the associate pastor. And the church, if you visited Oakhurst and Trinity United, the people that we heard speaking were associate pastors. And Richard Allen's ministry was primarily to free and enslaved Africans, and the membership of the church expanded greatly. It expanded so much that Allen wanted to form a new church, and they told him, well, no, we'll just expand St. George. So they built a balcony, and we're going to say surprisingly or not surprisingly, they relegated the African American enslaved and enslaved to the balcony. And those were not the only restrictions that were placed upon people. They were, African Americans, they had to wait until all the white members had taken communion, until they could take communion. I mentioned they had to sit in the balcony. And also the pastor of the church would not hold the Black children for christening. And so people still stayed at St. George's, and Richard Allen and Absalom Jones formed another organization called the Free Africa Society that they focused on support of African Americans at that time. But Allen really wanted to have a Black church, but they stayed at St. George until Absalom Jones came to St. George's and sat on the first floor. And he was promptly grabbed by the ushers and escorted out. And at that time, all of the Black members left and began to build their own church. Now, Richard Allen was quite an amazing person in that he not only was able to save enough money that while he was working at St. George's, he bought property. And when they decided to form another church that later became the AME Church, he bought a blacksmith shop and moved it to his land, and they renovated that to make what became Bethel AME Church in Philadelphia. And the Methodist Church, just to show you, I don't know how much things have changed, but we're going to say that things have changed a lot. They were like, okay, well, you're an associate Methodist minister, so your church is our church. And Richard Allen had to go to the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania to petition to keep his church. And the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania ruled that since it was his land and his money that he used to buy the new church, that the Methodist Church, the Methodist Episcopal Church, had no claim to his church. And so the AME Church, like many Black churches that you saw in the series, started educational associations, began African American schools, colleges. Wilberforce in Ohio is a school that was started by the AME Church. And I grew up in Bethel AME Church in Detroit. And one of the things that's mentioned in the series on the Black church is that different churches had different points of view or different ways of being. And the Bethel AME Church was in Detroit was called the Silk Stocking Church. And my father was a bus driver. And my mother felt like one of the reasons I've told many of you that I always dress up at church is that my mother always wished that she had various outfits to wear to fit in. And she only went to church when she had a new outfit. But my father took us to church every week. And so at Bethel AME Church, there was a children's church. And at the children's church, I was one of the ministers. So I started my speaking engagements early. I won a scholarship from a citywide oratorical contest. And the minister of our church, Reverend Roberts, was the head of the Detroit Council of Churches. And the Detroit Council of Churches every year sent someone to George Williams College camp to represent the city of Detroit. And I had an opportunity to go there and meet at a Christian conference that was composed of exchange students from all over the world. And perhaps that fueled my desire to continue to travel all over the world. And so the people at Bethel AME Church helped me get a job to work my way through Wayne State University undergrad. I taught Sunday school while I was in college. And I want to, briefly just mention a couple of other things that aren't necessarily related to me, but are related to the issues of the Black church. And one of the founding factors of the Methodist Church is modesty. And African Americans were considered, like all the people in colonial countries, and the British even called all of these people Aborigines, and that what needed to be done is that we needed to be civilized. And therefore, Joel Calkin in his book, Tribes, said that people in America are members of the British tribe. That's why everybody's gets your silver, your tea service, wear your hats for special occasions, that this is our British legacy. And most of the missionaries, many of the Black colleges were formed by the American Missionary Society. And that part of the education of African Americans was to be civilized. And to be civilized meant to be British. So that all of us, we wonder, well, why do we have to work to break that, to raise your hands or to clap your hands? Because we were taught that that's uncivilized. And during slavery, the only place in America that drums could be played by African slaves was New Orleans. And that's one of the reasons that it became the birthplace of jazz. And Africans could use drums to communicate, and that people in the South were afraid that that would be part of the slave uprising. So in the series on the Black church, you saw that many of the storefront churches that were created by people from the South was because the northern churches that had been established during Reconstruction were focusing more on making African Americans British. And during the Harlem Renaissance, one of the issues and one of the creative wellsprings was, what is African American? What is our legacy? What is our heritage? All right, so I hope that puts some of these things together, and I'll be here to answer questions or participate in a discussion.
Thank you, Madeline, for your insight and your information. I know it's asking a lot to narrow down all you know in 10 minutes, but we appreciate it. And as Madeline said, she'd be available to ask questions or answer questions when we continue on. Since I would like to start with a short prayer, if you'll join me in prayer. Creator God, lead us today as we learn more from our Black brothers and sisters about how to worship you. Amen. Starting out with the spiritual that we just heard, or the gospel music that we just heard from the Detroit Mass Choir, I think we can all agree that music, whether it's gospel, spiritual, or modern hymns, play a significant role in the Black church, in the worship. So I'd like to share with you just a little short piece that I found really fascinating about the hidden messages in spirituals. And this is from the Presbyterian Today, January, February issue this year, about hidden messages in spirituals. And they've picked just one spiritual, the Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, which we're all familiar with. Swing Low, Sweet Chariot was said to be a favorite spiritual of Harriet Tubman, who escaped from slavery in 1849. In the 1850s, she made many rescue trips into Maryland to help about 300 slaves escape to freedom. Most of the code words in the Negro spirituals refer to escape from slavery. The code words were used to hide the underlying secret message of the lyrics. Coded words, songs were a way for slaves to share the dream of freedom openly with one another, drawing inspiration and hope from the text. Without understanding the code, the lyrics appeared to have very different, non-threatening meanings to the slaveholders. So let me give you an example, just using the first verse of Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. For example, swing low actually meant come into the slave-holding states. Sweet Chariot actually meant the Underground Railroad. Coming for to carry me home actually meant come to take me to freedom in the North or in Canada. Verse 1, I looked over Jordan and what did I see? Actually meant I looked over the Mississippi River or the Ohio River, and what did I see? Jordan was the code word for those rivers. A band of angels were the workers of the Underground Railroad coming after me, helping me to reach the North. I thought that was really a fascinating look at just one of the spirituals and how it was used by slaves to communicate to each other, to inspire, to give each other hope. And I hope when we sing these spirituals in our own church, we'll have a better understanding of their history and their meaning. As you listen to Trinity United and Oakhurst Presbyterian, I'd like you to talk with me and have a little conversation with Madeline and I about what you saw in these services that may be similar to the way we worship at First Presbyterian, or some vast differences. And so I'm going to open it up for discussion, and I think you can unmute yourselves as when you want to say something, and I'll try to call on people as I see your hand up.
Mary Norris.
I think the thing that struck me the most, and
No, can't hear you.
You're muted, Mary.
I'm sorry. I thought I had unmuted. I think the few times that I've had the opportunity to worship in a Black church, I never felt that I was in the same place that the congregation was. And I think that this series has helped me understand that, because it's clear to me that those in the Black church, with the times I've gone, everyone that spoke about being in the spirit. And I think that's what we miss. I don't think, at least I, as a white person, had no idea what that meant. And knowing the history, or some of the history about the Black church, it made it so much more clear to me that our Black brothers and sisters had to be in the spirit, because that's the only place they could actually allow themselves for that to happen. And I never had to do that. I went to church because that's just what we did. It wasn't knowing and the spirit wasn't necessarily, I don't think, the spirit of God. It was the spirit of that connection, and the spirit that I can make it one more day. That was huge for me.
Judy, you're muted.
I know that several times in the PBS special, they mentioned and talked about the Black church's sanctuary, and a place where Black folk felt they could be in control. And I think that Mary has hit upon that subject.
I wanted to add that one of the experiences that I've had with dance, because I think that there's been like a misnomer that Black people can dance naturally, and that isn't true. It's just that very often in Black families and Black experience, that people start dancing younger, but in doing and having teachers teach us African and African American dance, and I'm saying Black people and white people, and that in Santa Fe we have African dance, and the teacher is white. And one of my friends said, well, how can you take an African dance class from somebody that's white, like all over the world? But we're saying, but the movements are African movements. And if you do those movements in Africa, they recognize them. And when people do those movements, no matter what color you are, if you do them enough, you will be in a trance state, because it's learned, it's not inherited.
Thank you, Cece.
Yes, and as a parallel to what is mentioned about, Blacks going to African Americans going to African American churches because they could be free there and be themselves. I can remember a high school classmate of mine who happens to be Catholic said that one of the reasons the inside of Catholic churches were so beautiful and calm was because that's one place that the poor Hispanics could go and see beauty and be left alone to do what they wanted. And so I think that's, to me, that's a very critical point in both of those churches.
Madeline?
One of the other things I wanted to mention that's very important, that we're talking about Protestant churches, the Catholic Church had a position that slaves had souls, so that they could marry and not be sold away, that families had to stay together. And that if we look at the largest concentration of slaves were in Bahia, in Brazil, and there many of the African customs have been maintained, and that the enslaved people rename the Catholic saints for African gods and goddesses, and that the dances and the rituals that they do, one of the services that I attended in Bahia, the service is done in Yoruba, just to show that the link has been maintained. And in a way, like some of the rituals in Brazil are more African than they are in Africa because of colonization.
David Mason?
I guess I have a question for either Madeline or Juanita, either one. What is it that drew you to First Church? I mean, it's obviously a predominant white community. Is it because of an absence of a Black church in Santa Fe, or was there something specifically that drew you to First Church?
I'll
For
go.
me,
Go ahead.
go on.
Go on. I'll go after you.
I was going to say, okay, things have changed since history. It's like, of course, yeah, I told you that I was going to church in Brooklyn and DC and Chicago during the pandemic. I was like, but so I used a new principle. Since the Black church is in me, I have something to share, and that I go to the church that's the closest to my house, because I visited all the churches near the plaza, and First Pres was very welcoming. People prayed for me, and Booker didn't go at first. And once Booker went to church and said, "Hey, Harry, how are you doing?" And Harry said, "Booker, however I was doing, I'm doing better now that you're here." And so we've been very pleased. Our grandchildren have enjoyed the church. My grandson particularly enjoyed the donuts, being part of the service and being there. Yeah, the 8:30 service has been wonderful.
Juanita?
Yeah, I just wanted to say before I answer that question, I grew up going to a Lutheran church in New York, in Manhattan. So I didn't have the Black church experience except for summers when I would go to Lizella, Macon, Georgia, to my mother's church, and we would spend summers at my grandparents' house. And I found it very fascinating and scary and interesting and odd, because they would have folks that would get filled with the Holy Spirit, and not being accustomed to that, it was a scary time because I didn't know what was going on and if that was going to happen to me. And being, even as a child, a person who was very much into being in control, I was always afraid that I'd get filled with the Holy Spirit and be out of control. And it wasn't until I took my mother back 3 years ago for her 90th birthday to Pleasant Grove Baptist Church in Lizella to celebrate their third Sunday in August, where everybody has a reunion, that I was hoping to get filled with the Holy Spirit, because I was old enough now to embrace all of what that church represented for my grandparents, for my cousins, for my aunts and uncles, for my mother, and now for me. So I hope to take my children, so they need to experience that. But the thing that brought me to First Presbyterian, and I think I shared this before, was I was looking for a church. I belonged to a Lutheran church in Santa Fe, and I was looking for a church that not only talked the talk, but walked the walk. And I found that First Presbyterian Church did exactly that. We are truly a place providing service to our community and to our members and congregation. And I want to be a part of a group that truly speaks service, not only on Sunday or when it's convenient, but every day. And that's something that I believe in and that I get support from Pastor Harry and the other members to do that and to walk that walk and to proudly say, I'm part of First Presbyterian, and this is what we can help you with.
Thank you, Juanita. I'm going to put in a little plug for Juanita. She's speaking at the men's breakfast. Is it the next men's breakfast coming up, Juanita? So she'll tell us a little bit more about herself and her occupation at that breakfast, but it's great to have you and to have that witness for our church as a church that works in the community. How about talking about things that you saw in the church services that if they happened at First Presbyterian would make you a little uncomfortable?
Not uncomfortable, but I want to see Linda Rainey do what that guy did. I want to see that.
I wondered if Harry would sing for us during his sermon. Harry, you want to talk about that?
I've heard
Oh, well,
you
you know,
speak.
I've done a few of those before, a line or two once in a while, or got the choir going. I remember one time I was doing a World Communion Sunday, I talked about I'd like to teach the world to sing, and by the time I got to teach, the choir was all with me, and so we sang together. I must tell you that I've had the best times preaching at a predominantly African American church back in Ohio when we shared things together, and there's no better experience than to have that sense of call and response, to say something and have somebody respond. The Presbyterian church has been characterized as, you have them if no one's moving. If no one's coughing or no one's scratching their head, you got them. And it's so different being in an African American situation or a Black church situation. And I say, oh man, they're letting me know what's happening to them, and that helps me along. So it's quite an experience. I just wanted to share that. But I'll sing more if you want. I'm right there. Just give me the okay.
I think Alice and then Sue.
I didn't know I was raising my hand, but
Okay.
but I won't refuse to talk. It just seems like what we saw in our homework was just full body involvement. And I was speaking to my daughter in Austin, and she said, well, she loves the music from the Black churches. And she said, I'd go to church if they'd sing like that, And so I found that interesting.
Sue?
Yes, I was just going to say, in reference to the relationship between the choir and the congregation, our tradition, I've sung in choirs since I was in junior high, is that you rehearse, and there's always kind of a wall between the choir and the congregation. It's not always necessarily a good thing, but that's just the tradition. And I think it would make the choir nervous if the congregation joined in. Not that that's wrong. It's just a very different tradition, which is in some ways, too bad. But it's the format.
In one piece I read recently, it said that the role of music in the Black church is to prepare your soul for hearing the word. And I thought that was an interesting way of talking about the role of music. And perhaps that is true in our own church. Other comments? Alice, again.
Yeah.
This time I
Yeah.
did see your hand.
I just wanted to mention that there was a special that followed the second episode of The Black Church with Henry Louis Gates Jr. And it's called Amen, the music of the Black Church. And it was produced by Indiana University. And it's well worth finding on Comcast or wherever you can get PBS shows. And obviously IU is such a big music college that this was a well sought out group. And there were mostly Blacks in the group, but there were a lot of white students also. And they were just singing away, and it made me feel good to see everybody enjoying the music so much. It's well worth seeing.
Thank you, Alice. One of the things that I've noticed when I've been watching several of the Black church services on YouTube is that they oftentimes some of them are mega churches and are, for example, Trinity, the one that we watched, is an enormous church, as you saw. And they really consider themselves a village. And as part of this village, when you go on their website, you'll see that, and some of these things our church also does, but you'll see that they have a food distribution. They work within the prisons. They have a credit union, their own credit union. They also have AA meetings, which of course we also sponsor in our church, and really see themselves as a community or a church working within the community, as Juanita mentioned, and I feel our church also does. They talked in the Black church about the Black church was a nation within a nation. What would be your response to that? Or how do you understand a church being a nation within a nation? Madeline? Madeline, I think you're muted if you had your hand up.
Okay, I'm going to do three things. One, I wanted to say that First Pres for me was just like Bethel AME, that the first Soul Festival was there, that we had our watch night service, that the ideas of, okay, bringing my culture, sharing it with the church and the church sharing it with the community. And I also want to tell a story that Malcolm Gladwell said about Martin Luther King, which was that Martin Luther King, with his PhD, that he would spend 15 hours a week preparing his sermon, writing it, and then he would memorize it and perform it or give it. But when he was about to start the Montgomery bus boycott, he only had 15 minutes, and it threw him off. And the person quoted Miles Davis that improvisation gives you a chance to listen to the spirit of the music. And so Martin Luther King had an idea of what he wanted to talk about, but he didn't have time. He didn't have 15 hours. He only had 15 minutes. So he went and talked about the moment, and that the African tradition of call response, the people in the church, when he started saying things about what they were experiencing in Montgomery, that the church started encouraging him. And that's how he gave a sermon that he had to go outside of himself. And that he did the same thing on the March on Washington, that he had time to carefully construct his sermon. And Mahalia Jackson said, "Tell him about the dream, Martin." And that's when the most famous part of the speech, was created on the spot, the improvisation that was not his, hey, that's not our PhD method. We have to learn to let ourselves go.
Sue?
It's interesting. Our son does lots of jazz, has studied it his whole life, and reads about it a lot. And it's your reference to improvisation is very interesting because to be good at improvisation, you, like Martin Luther King, you have to have the tradition, the study to come before it, so that you've got that pool of more traditional preparation and understanding about harmony, and for him the text, to draw on when you move to the higher discipline level of improvisation, that it's not just something that it's based on something, quite structured, and then you're free. It's a very interesting comparison.
Thank you, Sue. Cece?
In terms of the African American churches being a nation within a nation, it's kind of sad that they have to be their own nation in order to live the way they want, just as it's sad because the Native Americans have had to do the same thing. So I think it says a lot more about the white nation than it does about the African American or the Native American, that they have to feel they have to structure their own nation.
I think it was also talking about the social services that the churches have offered, and particularly historically, when the Black church was the one place people could go to communicate with each other, to inspire each other, commiserate with each other, and possibly plan revolt with each other or escape. I have a quote that I want to read from, it's from, again, Presbyterian Today, the magazine, and it's from an executive presbyter for the Presbytery of Cincinnati in Ohio, Lisa Allgood. And she's talking about the times we're living in now. We are in that weird in-between space where we left what used to be and we haven't yet inhabited what's coming. Take that time to really go back and do some deep introspection about what is essential to your worship, because you may end up leaving some things behind as you get down to the core. Look to the future. We are not going to be here forever. We will go back. It may not look like what you had, but think, what is God dreaming for you for the future? What is God dreaming for our church for the future? Cece?
Did you call me?
I did. Did you have your hand up?
Oh, yes, I did. Well, I think one of the things that our church is doing in preparation for how we're going to have to live in the future is this particular class here and many other classes we have. I have learned a lot about people of color, where they came from, what they have to deal with and everything. And we are going to have to work with those various communities moving forward, because we can't afford to not work with them. They have as much to give to us as we have to give to them. And I think we at the First Presbyterian Church of Santa Fe have made some great strides in it, even though we probably have a lot more strides to do. But That's it.
Judy, I'm
Harry?
going to jump in here. Every week I'm going to be adding another idea when I write my letter to the saints about things I've picked up, read about, experienced, hoped for, whatever, that we might be open to as we go through this pandemic and beyond. And so today I wrote about just as we gather in what we call committee meetings, what that might look like in the future after we've had the Zoom experience, and knowing that sometimes people don't look forward to the next month's committee meeting, but they look forward to being together and relationship building and so forth. And so that's one of the ideas. I think also we had a Bible study this morning at 11 o'clock for those who were there. It was that famous John 3:16 passage verse, for God so loved the world, and so forth. And it had the word believe in there. And we, as Presbyterians, don't do well with the heart. And that's what believe really means, what you give your heart to. We think believe is all about what we think up here in the mind. And if we're going to be open to God's moving spirit, I think we need to get out of the mind some more, get down to the heart, which some people say is the longest 18 inches you can ever make in your life, from your heart to your head to your heart. And that may be one of the big challenges we as Presbyterians have. Keep the thinking, the mind and so forth, but add the heart to it. And that's what we've been talking about here, some of the experiences we've seen in the Black church and the worship services. Bring the heart in.
Thank you, Harry. I think you've got your first sermon there. Any other ideas about change? What you look forward to when you go back to church, when we see each other? We've talked a lot about that, how we miss that personal contact with people, and other ideas that you have gained or thought about over this time of pandemic. Well, I hope this will, Mary.
I think the one thing, and a comment just about improvisation, and I so appreciated, I think it was Sue that was saying, I think it's one of the most, I don't know what the right word is, but it's just a sign of, I believe, white privilege, that we would think that just because someone happens to have a darker skin, somehow those people just can get up and sing or talk or dance or do any of those things because they just have an innate talent for doing that. And we completely ignore the fact that those individuals have worked like crazy to hone their skills. And so I think to understand that if we want to participate in a congregation the way a Black community would communicate in a congregation, then we must hone our skills of how to worship in that way. It's not that anybody, Reverend Barbie did not learn to preach the way she preaches because she happens to be a Black woman. She's worked her ass off. And so I think that we really, if we want to change the way we worship, then we've got to practice a different way to worship. And we have to be willing to learn a different way to worship. And we have to open our heart to each other and to God.
Thank you, Mary. I know there are many things that we love about our church and we wouldn't think about changing. But I think this discussion today has kind of, I hope, just helped us to think about each part of our service and part of our church. Madeline, did you have some closing words?
Well, one of the things I wanted to add about improvisation, since some of the people are knitting, that improvisation is, the psychological term now is flow, and that after you have mastered a skill, that after you know how to do some dance, you can then improvise. And after you know how to learn how to crochet or quilt, that then it's relaxing. It's not relaxing when you first start, but after you master the skill, then you can get into that liminal space of improvisation and relaxation and letting the spirit have his way.
Thank
But
you,
I
Madeline.
appreciate Mary's insight. And David was going to say something. He had his hand up.
David?
Well, last Sunday during the breakout period, I asked Linda Rainey what she thought about the choir, maybe doing more spirituals and everything. And she said they've tried it, and the comment she used was, it doesn't translate. And I was wondering if it would be the same way if we tried to get more into a spiritual type services down the road. Is it going to translate with us white folks? Because we haven't went back to the Black community.
Well, I want to share something with you, David, which is at Wheeler Avenue Baptist Church, we had amazing choirs, and that I was one of the people used to come up to me and say, I wish I could worship like, I wish I could do what you do. And these people were Black. Okay. So it's something that some people say you just have to do or not do, and I have to also say that my grandson goes to Emmanuel Baptist Church, in a Black church in Brooklyn. And when he came to the Santa Fe Soul Festival here, that was the first time in his life that he ever he stood up and moved to the spirit. His mother said he had not moved at all, that he had been a stone. So
maybe it's like John Whitcomb describes us as Presbyterians being the frozen chosen. We're very stoic and everything else, but I would love it if we would get more. I notice sometimes, Madeline, when you've been the liturgist and the songs are being sung, you get into it. And I just, I tend to be there very, like I was raised in this church. You sit in the pew and you speak when spoken to type thing.
yeah.
Well, if there aren't any other comments, I'd like to thank Madeline again for joining us and sharing with us. And Juanita also, thank you for your words about our church, which were very inspiring and encouraging. I think we are so lucky to have the church we have and the people in it. And I, as all of you, look forward to the time when we can all be back together and listening to Harry and singing together, no matter how we do it. So thank you so much. And Gail, did you have something you wanted to mention about next week's class?
Well, no, Mary's the one doing that.
Okay, Mary, did you have a thought?
I do. Well, I do. And it's like, I'm hoping after the Monday planning group really kind of helped me to get a little more comfortable with what I kind of always wanted to do. So it is next week. We really, we're looking at Black arts, but I will just tell you that Black art in my mind includes a culinary art. And so we're going to talk a little bit about soul food, which is not necessarily greens and and fried chicken. It is, it's really looking at starting with Edna Lewis, who is the mother of really the farm to table movement. She was awarded a James Beard Award. She's just an icon and a rock star in the world of food. And we'll move from her on to a group of young chefs who are very much, chefs of color. We'll talk a little bit about the Gula people that live in the islands off of the Carolinas and Florida and Georgia. and about just a really wonderful young chef who's also a James Beard finalist that has a restaurant in Savannah. So it's really, it's just a wonderful array of individuals that have and continue to hone their craft. And it is talking about that Southern cooking. It was one of the articles I've read says, white people wrote it down, but Black people developed it. So it's just, I hope you enjoy it as much as I enjoy reading about it and practicing it. It's a skill I'm trying to hone.
You're making us all hungry, Mary.
I wish we were together because I'd bring Edna's buttermilk cookies if I could, because they are over the top.
You'll bring recipes at least, right?
Will. Oh, I'll definitely do that.
Yeah, that's something to put in the chat for next week. Thank you all for attending today. See you in a week.
Thank you.